The sun dropped behind the bare ridges, leaving the town's single street in a bruised light. Dust clung to every board and window, and the saloon doors creaked as though sighing under the weight of another day gone. He stood at the edge of the street, hat in hand, boots scuffed raw from weeks of work that never seemed to earn him more than sneers. The rancher's name carried little weight here, but the whispers did. They called him a fool. They said only a desperate man would hand over a single dollar for a bride no one else wanted. He could feel those words press against his back even when no one was speaking them. His chest tightened like a rope pulled too hard, and he wondered if the soil under his boots would ever feel like his own. She arrived without ceremony, stepping down from a wagon that rattled away before the dust had settled. Her dress was travel-worn, the hem torn and dulled with earth, her shoulders squared, as though she had already braced for battle. No one came to greet her except him, and even then, his hand faltered before touching hers. Their eyes met his weary, hers hollow but fierce, and in that silence, a promise passed between them, unspoken yet binding. Behind lace gloves, her fingers trembled, but when he offered his arm, she accepted with a dignity that belied the bargain that brought her here. The cabin he led her to was bare wood and wind gaps, a structure more stubborn than secure. She touched the walls with her palm, feeling the cold seep through, and said nothing. He stoked the stove as if flame could mask his shame, but she took the iron poker from him, set her jaw, and built the fire higher. That was her first act in the house, and it told him more than words ever could. She would not yield easily. He lay awake that night, listening to her quiet breathing in the other room, wondering what story had carried her across the country to his door, wondering if $1 had bought him salvation or ruin. In days that followed, the town kept its watchful distance, though its gossip moved quicker than wind. At the mercantile, women stared over bolts of cloth, and men smirked by the barrels of nails. She bore it with a silence that unnerved them. Each morning she carried water from the creek, split kindling, swept the dirt floor, her back straight even as her hands bled. He found himself watching her, not with pity, but with a dawning respect. She did not complain, nor did she soften her gaze. Yet at dusk, when he returned from driving cattle, he sometimes caught her at the window, her eyes far away, and he knew loneliness pressed on her as surely as the prairie wind. Her past revealed itself not through confession but in fragments, a locket worn smooth at her throat, a hymn hummed under her breath, a tremor when thunder rolled across the plains. He guessed she had left more behind than she could bear to speak of. Still, she carried herself as though her sorrow was a secret weapon, sharpened and hidden. He wanted to ask, but the words died in his throat. His own losses sat like stones inside him, buried kin, a homestead burned in drought, a faith that faltered, two wounded souls, bound not by romance but by circumstance, learning the measure of each other through chores, through silence, through the fragile ritual of sharing bread at a rough-hewn table. One evening, a storm split the sky, flinging rain like gravel against the windows. She worked beside him to keep the roof from lifting, her hair soaked, her hands raw, her body straining against the gale. In the lantern's flicker, he saw her strength, not borrowed but her own, and something within him eased. When the wind relented, she sank onto the floor, chest heaving, and met his gaze. For the first time since her arrival, she smiled not wide, but enough to crack the armor she wore. He felt something settle deep in his chest, a seed planted in ground once thought barren. The town would not relent. They laughed louder when they passed, mocked him with sly glances, spoke of her as though she were less than whole. He bore it as he always had, shoulders bent, mouth closed. But one morning at the well, a man spat at her feet, muttering about women bought for pennies. She looked at the rancher then, waiting. He stepped forward, slow and steady, his fists not raised but his voice low and sharp, telling the man that any insult to her was an insult to him and to the land that fed them all. The air thickened, the crowd hushed, and for a moment he was no longer the fool who paid a single dollar. He was a man who had chosen, and chosen fiercely. That night, as they sat in silence by the fire, she placed the locket on the table between them. "I left everything behind," she said at last, her voice steady but thin. "If I am to build again, it must be here." His throat closed. He reached across the rough wood and covered her hand with his. Words were scarce, but none were needed. In that moment, the cabin ceased to be a refuge of shame. It became a beginning. Morning settled into a pattern that felt like breath. Draw water, mend fences, move cattle, cook simple meals that tasted of smoke and salt. She learned where the mud swallowed boot heels after rain, where the creek ran deep beneath a crust of reeds, where the wind found the smallest cracks and made music of them through the walls. The tools were unfamiliar in her hands at first, but she learned their weight, the way a pianist learns keys by repetition, by listening for what sings and what grinds. She blistered, bled, and hardened. When she carried pails from the creek, she took the long way past a stand of cottonwoods that rang with bright birds, and in that detour the rancher recognized a stubborn mercy she extended to herself. He said nothing of it, but he began to leave an apple on the table some mornings, or a slice of last year's dried peach, offerings as modest and sacred as coins placed at a shrine. The burden she bore drifted into view like the far line of hills, first a shade of blue, then a ridge. In the lamplight she traced the locket's oval with her thumb, and told him a little, not all. A sister buried before winter, a boarding house where the walls sang with other people's sorrow, a foreman who promised safety for a price and took more than coin. She had sold the last of her keepsakes to cross the plains, then sold herself to what came next because there were no more things left to trade but time and skin and hope. He listened with his head bowed, the way one listens at a grave. In his chest, shame shifted into reverence. The word bride, so cheap on other tongues, began to feel like a title he had not earned yet. He showed her his own hidden rooms, without meaning to. One afternoon by the corral, she found a small book wrapped in oilcloth, beneath a saddle blanket, thin pages, filled with his father's cramped script. Measurements for mending harness, a prayer for rain, a recipe for a tonic to ease fever made from willow bark and mint. He had been copying the old man's notes since boyhood, hoping to keep a voice that death had taken. She handed the book back to him and said, almost smiling, that his father wrote like someone who knew loss and kept working anyway, a thread tied between them then, not by pity, but by the fact of surviving. In town the air was more brittle. The mercantile's bell clanged like judgment. The proprietor's wife watched her from behind glass jars of barley and beans, eyes sharp as pins. Men gathered by the freight wagon, talking loud enough to be overheard about ranchers who bought wives the way they bought yearlings. She kept her gaze level. When she asked for soap and calico, the proprietor weighed each request like a sin. She paid with the rancher's coin, counted slow and sure, and left with her chin high, though the words followed like burrs. By the time she reached the edge of the street, her breath came fast and shallow. She stopped under the telegraph pole and pressed her palm to its tarred skin until the tremor passed. He saw it from the hitch rail and walked to her, not touching, only standing close enough that anyone watching would have to reckon with the shadow their two bodies cast together. As spring unraveled, the creek ran clouded. Calves sickened in the pens near town. A little boy staggered down the street in mid-afternoon heat, his mouth white at the corners. She knelt to meet him and felt the hot press of his skin. His mother snatched him back with a hard whisper for her not to touch. That night the bell at the small church tolled once, then again, and the sound felt like a nail driven into the air. The rancher watched her face in the firelight. She had gone terribly still, as if listening for steps on a stair that only she could hear. The next morning she asked him to hitch the team. They drove to the mouth of the creek where cattle watered. She knelt and stared into the eddies, scooped a handful, poured it through her fingers. A slick sheen filmed the surface, and the smell carried a sour rot. Upstream, a dead heifer lay snagged in willow roots, swollen and beginning to split. She swallowed hard and set her jaw. When she spoke, her voice was a rope thrown true. Boil every drop, burn the carcass, dig a pit and lime it. Move the town's water barrels to the east standpipe that feeds from the spring above the ash slope. She said it with a quiet authority that startled him. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, as they shoved the heifer from the roots with poles. "City pumps," she said. "Tenement alleys that stank in summer. A woman who taught her that cleanliness is not pride but survival." They worked until their hands cramped. Still, the town balked. The proprietor's wife declared that panic killed faster than tainted water, and a man with a silver watch chain laughed that no woman bought for $1 would tell him how to guard his children. She did not answer him. She walked to the church and spoke to the preacher instead. In a side room smelling of wax and damp wood, she showed him the locket's hinge and the clean paper tucked inside where a photograph had been. On it, in a careful hand, 3 words: "Boil the water." The preacher had buried 2 people that week. He nodded and rang the bell until the town gathered. They dug, they burned. She stood at the pit while the carcass caught, smoke rising in a column that looked like a black thorn in the sky. Men watched her face, waiting for her to falter. She did not. At the standpipe, she organized aligned buckets, passed hand to hand, lids kept tight. A boy with a ladle posted to remind old men not to dip with bare cups. She sent women home with instructions to simmer water to a rolling boil and add a pinch of salt. When someone scoffed at the pinch, she said salt makes people drink again after fever drains them, and there was no laughter then. The rancher moved where she pointed, driving the team, hauling slaked lime, his body a blunt instrument tuned to her purpose. By dusk, the sky had gone the color of bruised plums. The church bell was silent. She sat on the steps with her dress streaked gray, hair clinging to her neck, eyes hollowed by fatigue but fierce. The proprietor's wife approached, carrying a covered bowl. She set it beside her, not looking her in the eye, and said that she had boiled the water twice and scalded the tin ladle for good measure. Then, after a pause that felt like a thaw, she added that the boy down the lane was breathing easier. The rancher stood in the street and watched a change move through the crowd, not gratitude yet, but the bared teeth of mockery dulling into a kind of wary respect. He felt pride rise in him like a slow, steady flame. It was not for himself. It was for the woman beside him who had turned a day toward life. When they reached the cabin, he poured water into a basin and brought a cloth. She dipped it, wrung it out, and pressed it to the back of her neck with a soft exhale. He set the little book of his father on the table and opened to the page on fevers. She took up a stub of pencil and, with careful letters, added a line: "Boil the water, add salt, keep the shade." He watched her write herself into his legacy. The room, which had once felt borrowed and thin, thickened around them like early bread dough finding its shape. He could see the outline of a future then not gilded, not easy, but real. The fever broke from the town as quickly as it had come, leaving behind shallow graves and houses marked by silence. Yet where despair might have taken root, resilience grew instead. Mothers began to boil every pot of water without needing to be told, and men who once sneered at her name tipped their hats when she passed. It unsettled her, this sudden shift from ridicule to reverence. She carried herself no differently, but in their eyes she was transformed, no longer a purchased bride, but a guardian of their children. The rancher noticed the change most keenly at the mercantile. Where once the proprietor's wife had pinched her lips tight as a knot, now she wrapped cloth without a word and slipped a sprig of lavender into the parcel. Small gestures, but each one carried the weight of an unspoken apology. He watched his wife. He could think of her no other way now, accept these offerings with the same steady grace she had shown under scorn. She did not gloat, did not soften. She remained the same woman who had knelt by a pit of burning carrion and shown the town how to survive. But when they left, he saw her fingers rest against the locket at her throat, as if she could not quite believe this turn of fate. The ranch work deepened between them. He showed her how to ride with the herd, how to read the earth for signs of storm or stampede. She learned quickly, seat firm, eyes sharp. One afternoon, as they mended fence line, he caught her laughing an unguarded sound, rough with disuse, but bright as water over stones. It startled him, more than any shout could. He felt something break loose in his chest, something he had held too tightly for too long. That night, when she came in from the yard with dirt on her hands and a stray thread of hair loose across her brow, he reached for her without thought. She did not flinch. Their silence became something else then, not emptiness but shelter. Yet trouble never stayed far from the edge of town. A man arrived one gray morning, boots polished, coat fine enough to mark him as not belonging. He carried a ledger under his arm and a voice sharp with authority. He spoke of debts the town owed to suppliers back east, of missed payments, of contracts binding tighter than rope. The preacher frowned, the proprietor paled, and whispers spread like fire. When the rancher asked what remedy was offered, the man's smile did not reach his eyes. He said the land might be seized, livestock sold, houses stripped for timber. Behind his smooth words lay ruin. That night, the woman sat by the fire with her hands folded tight in her lap. "It begins again," she whispered, not to him but to herself. He turned from the stove. She spoke of a foreman once, a man who had used law like a blade to gut whole neighborhoods. She had seen families thrown into the street while officials counted coin. She knew the scent of such men, their silk gloves, their ledgers heavy with ink and threat. Her voice was low but steady as she said, "If they divide us, they will take everything. But if the town stands together, they will have nothing to sell." The rancher looked at her then with new eyes. She was not only strong in arm and spirit, she was keen, forged in fires of injustice. He realized the $1 he had given months ago had not bought him a wife. It had brought to his side a woman who carried the wisdom of survival etched into her very bones. So they called a meeting in the church, the same place where she had first turned suspicion into faith. The town gathered, restless, fearful. The man with the ledger sat at the front, pen poised like a weapon. She stood, the only woman among them to raise her voice. She reminded them of the fever, of how quickly despair might take hold when fear ruled. She spoke not of debt, but of dignity, not of law, but of lives. She told them the land was not theirs to sell because it belonged to the graves of their kin, to the children who drank from its streams, to the sweat that salted its soil. Silence held when she finished. Then the rancher stepped forward, laid his father's book on the table, and read aloud a passage about labor, faith, and the worth of earth when tended with care. One by one, men and women began to nod. The preacher struck his hand against the pew, and the sound echoed like a hammer on anvil. The town chose to resist, to stand as one. The man with the ledger left before dawn, his coat still fine, his threats intact, but his power dissolved in the wake of their unity. As he rode out, she watched from the porch, shoulders squared, eyes unyielding. For the first time since arriving, she did not feel like a stranger. She felt like part of the soil itself, bound to it by sweat, by courage, by choice. That evening, the rancher found her at the creek, the locket open in her hand. She closed it slowly and slipped it back around her neck. When she turned to him, her gaze was softer than he had ever seen. "I was bought for $1, she said quietly, "but here I have found what no coin could ever measure." He stepped closer, took her hand, and the world hushed around them. In that silence, the mocking voices of the past dissolved. What remained was the steady pulse of water, the scent of damp earth, and the fragile, unbreakable truth that they had chosen each other against scorn, against ruin, against all odds. Summer laid itself heavy over the plains, the heat flattening the grass and driving cattle to shade where cottonwoods clung to the creek bank. Work became a matter of endurance, each breath drawn through dust, each step weighted. The rancher's skin bronzed darker, his shirt clung wet at the collar, and still he pushed the herd, repaired fence, hauled water. She matched him. Her hands grew calloused, her arms sinewed by labor she had once never known. Townsfolk who passed the ranch saw her bent at the well or riding beside him, no longer a curiosity but a fact. A woman who belonged to the land as much as any man born to it. Yet beneath that strength lived the ache of memory. Some nights she woke with her breath sharp, the locket clutched so tightly in her fist that the metal cut her palm. He lay awake beside the thin wall, listening to her quiet gasps. Once he stepped to her door, his hand against the frame, but he did not enter. The silence between them was fragile, not yet ready to be broken by words of comfort. Instead, in the morning, he left an extra bucket of water by the door, or sharpened her tools before she reached for them. It was his way of saying, "I see you, even when I do not ask." Her laughter, when it came, was sudden and startling. She laughed once when a colt nosed its way into the kitchen and toppled a pot of beans. Another time, when the rancher misbuttoned his shirt so badly he looked half drunk. Each small burst of joy struck like rain on parched ground. He learned to savor those moments more than any meal or rest. They were proof that the wound she carried was healing, stitch by stitch. But harmony never lasted long in the frontier. The drought deepened, and tempers in town grew brittle. Whispers spread that the man with the ledger would return, this time with papers signed in far-off courts. Some said the town could not withstand the law twice. Fear pooled in corners of the saloon, in hushed talk at the well. Old rivalries resurfaced. A family spoke of selling their land before it could be taken. Another muttered about turning blame on the rancher and his bride, calling them trouble bringers. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a stone crashed through the cabin window. She rose from the table, heart pounding, glass crunching under her boots. Outside, only dust and distance stared back. The rancher swept the shards aside, jaw clenched, eyes dark. She touched his arm, steadying him, though her own hands shook. The next morning, he rode into town to demand an answer. Men turned away. Women pressed lips tight. The sheriff muttered about boys and mischief, but the weight in his eyes said otherwise. The rancher returned, shoulders taut, carrying silence with him. That night, she chose to speak what she had long held in. Sitting at the hearth, the fire low, she told him about the foreman who had cornered her once in a boarding-house stairwell, about how her refusal had cost her work, shelter, safety. She spoke of leaving behind the graves of her kin, walking streets where no one spoke her name, and finally choosing the paper that promised passage to a stranger's home. Her voice did not break, it sharpened. She ended with, "I will not be broken again, not by ledger, not by fear, not by stones thrown in the dark." He listened, unmoving, but inside him something shifted permanent. He realized her strength was not armor but scar, and with that came a fierce protectiveness, not of possession, but of devotion. He reached across the narrow space, his hand covering hers where it rested on her knee. The fire crackled, and she let her hand stay beneath his. Days later, the man with the ledger returned, riding in with dust on his boots and law in his saddlebag. This time he carried papers thick with signatures, stamped with seals that seemed to carry more weight than the land itself. The town gathered, restless and brittle. The preacher read the words aloud, his voice trembling. Fear pressed down like a storm cloud. She stepped forward. Her dress was plain, her hands rough, but her voice cut clear through the murmur. She spoke of survival, of how they had faced fever together, how no piece of paper could erase what had been built with blood and sweat. She told them the law might belong to far-off men, but justice belonged to those who buried their children in this ground, who carried scars in their palms from tilling it. Her words carried the fire of truth, and silence fell heavy. The rancher joined her, laying his father's book on the table once more. He spoke not as a man mocked, but as one who had chosen his place and his partner. "We will not yield," he said, and his voice, though quiet, rang harder than any gavel. The town stood. One by one they sided with them, their voices gathering into a chorus that no ledger could quiet. The man with the fine coat found himself facing not a broken settlement, but a wall of unshakable resolve. He left with his papers untouched, his threats hollow. That night, as crickets sang from the dry grass, she sat beside the rancher on the porch. The moon laid a pale path across the land. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time, her body softened fully into his. He wrapped his arm around her, not in triumph, but in quiet gratitude. The land still bore scars, the future still uncertain, but together they had carved a place where neither coin nor mockery could reach. Autumn drifted in, the heat easing into a cooler wind that rattled the cottonwoods. The earth smelled of dust and faint rain, though the sky rarely gave more than a scatter of drops. Work slowed, but not by much. Fences still sagged, cattle still strayed, roofs still leaked. She moved through the days with a steadiness that had become second nature. Her hands no longer blistered, they bore the hardened strength of labor. She had become part of the land's rhythm, and the land, grudgingly, seemed to accept her. In town, children followed her with wide eyes, whispering to each other about the woman who had saved them from fever. Mothers sought her quiet counsel on small sicknesses, on how to keep a home free of rot. Men tipped their hats without smirk or sneer, as if ashamed of what they had once called her. The rancher watched all this with a muted awe. He knew the town had not been given a savior, but a survivor, a woman who carried her past like a brand and had learned to forge it into strength. Yet shadows still lingered. The man with the ledger had not returned, but the threat of his kind hung over them all. At night, when the lamps guttered low, she would sometimes sit by the window with the locket open in her lap, staring at its empty hinge. Once he asked softly, "Do you miss them?" She did not turn, only nodded, her voice little more than breath. Every day. He wanted to give her words to ease the ache, but none came. Instead, he placed his father's book beside her on the sill, open to a prayer for endurance. She touched the page, her fingers lingering there, and though she said nothing, her shoulders eased. One afternoon, a fire broke in the dry grass north of town. The wind fanned it fast, licking toward barns and homesteads. Bells rang, men shouted, wagons rolled with barrels sloshing. The rancher spurred his horse into the smoke, and without hesitation she followed. They fought side by side, beating flames with wet sacks, hauling water until their arms trembled. Heat scorched their faces, smoke seared their throats, but still they pressed on. When at last the flames broke and died, the town stood blackened but whole. Neighbors clasped their hands, tears streaking their ash-stained faces. And once again it was she who had steadied them with calm commands, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with men twice her size. That night, the rancher found her outside the cabin, her hair tangled with smoke, her palms blistered raw. He brought a basin of water, cool against the red welts. She did not resist when he knelt and bathed her hands, each touch tender as a vow. In the silence, something unspoken deepened between them. Not bought, not owed, chosen. The bond had been forged not in coin but in fire and toil. Winter followed, harsh and unforgiving. Snow laid thick, fences vanished beneath drifts, and the cattle bawled against hunger. They worked together to keep the herd alive, breaking ice on the creek, rationing feed. Nights were long, and the cold pressed close, but within the cabin the fire burned steady. She mended clothes by lamplight, humming low, while he read from his father's book, adding her notes in the margins beside his own. In the stillness of one such night, he turned to her and spoke plain. "I would not change it, not any of it, not the dollar, not the scorn, because it brought you here." Her eyes shone in the lamplight, and for once she did not hide the tremor of her lips. She reached across the table, lacing her fingers with his, and whispered, "Then we will keep building, you and I." The seasons would turn again, with new trials and new reckonings, but the town no longer mocked, and the rancher no longer carried shame. They had been tested by fever, fire, and scorn, and through it all had chosen each other. Their home stood, warm against the cold, its walls carrying not the echo of emptiness, but the breath of two souls, bound by resilience and love. Beyond the window, snow fell in soft silence, blanketing the land, promising rest before spring's return. Within, their joined hands lay steady on the table, a vow without words, strong as the land itself.